Your manager sent a one-line email this morning. No context, just, "Can we find time to talk this week?"
And something in you immediately started cataloging everything you might have done wrong.
You didn't do anything wrong.
You know that, technically,
But the search has already begun, running in the background.
because some part of your nervous system has decided that a closed-door conversation is a threat until proven otherwise.
That your approval here is provisional.
That goodwill can be revoked without warning, and early detection is your best protection.
This is not anxiety in the clinical sense. From the outside, you look diligent, responsive, professional, good at your job. On the inside, you are constantly doing a calculation. How am I perceived? What do they need from me? What do I need to be to stay safe? And here's what makes it hard to talk about. The strategy works. You are good at your job. You are well regarded.
It's succeeding so completely that you can't tell anymore where the strategy ends and where you begin. What I want to offer you is a way of understanding why this keeps happening that has nothing to do with your willpower. Because the script you're running at work isn't a work script. It's much, much older than your job.
In the 1950s, John Bowlby proposed something radical, that human beings are driven not by hunger or pleasure, but by attachment, by the need to maintain closeness with a caregiver who can keep us safe. The attachment behavioral system is not metaphorical.
It is a biological mechanism, as real and physical as the immune system.
Its job is to monitor the availability of the people we depend on, and to activate behavior that restores closeness.
In infancy, that system organizes around your primary caregiver, and depending on how consistently, how attuned, how predictably that caregiver was available,
you develop what researchers call an attachment strategy,
a set of rules for how to behave in close relationships.
Here's what no one told you. That strategy doesn't stay in childhood.
It doesn't get filed away once you graduate.
It migrates into every relationship where there is a meaningful power differential, where someone holds something you need.
Which is to say, it migrates directly into your working life, and takes up residence there so completely that you'd have no reason to suspect.
Your attachment system does not know the difference between your mother and your manager,
between your father and the organization.
It knows threat, and it knows the protocol that has historically reduced threat.
And it runs that protocol on whoever is in the caregiving position.
Think of it like this. Beneath the operating system, you consciously run your career on the goals, the skills, the professional persona.
There is older firmware. Firmware written before you had language. Firmware that has never been updated because it has never needed to be.
It just keeps running in the background, shaping every interaction you have with power in ways you're not quite fast enough to catch. And the question that makes the next part of this necessary is not, what is my attachment style? You can take a quiz for that. The question is, what specific behavior at work is the firmware actually producing, and what did that behavior originally cost you not to do?
There are three main attachment strategies. Secure. The caregiver was reliably available, so you learned that proximity is achievable without distortion.
Anxious. The caregiver was inconsistently available, warm sometimes, distracted others, loving in ways that were hard to predict. So you learn to amplify your attachment signals.
To be more visible, more pleasing, more vigilant. To turn the dial up until the response came. And avoidant. The caregiver was consistently unavailable for emotional closeness. So you learn to suppress the need for connection entirely. I want to stay with the anxious and the fawn strategies for a moment, because they produce the most recognizable career patterns.
If you grew up in an environment where love, approval, or safety was inconsistently available, where the warmth was real but unpredictable,
you didn't become clingy or needy in the way we usually picture.
You became excellent. You became the person who reads the room, who anticipates what's needed before it's asked,
who never lets the performance slip because a dropped performance is where inconsistency lives. And you brought that exact skill set into your career.
It probably got you the job. It probably got you promoted.
The ability to read a room, to manage up, to make yourself indispensable. These are not small things.
The world rewards them.
But here's what it costs. Underneath the success.
If your belonging at work feels conditional on your continued performance,
if the approval feels like something you maintain rather than something you have, then you cannot afford to be ordinary on any given day.
You cannot call in sick without guilt. You cannot produce average work in an average week and let it be average without a background hum of danger.
You cannot say I don't know in a meeting without it registering somewhere as a threat to your position in the room.
And the fawn response, the one that makes you apologize when you weren't wrong, agree when you don't agree,
shrink when you should hold ground. That response was not a weakness when you were young.
In an environment where a caregiver's mood was the weather and you were responsible for tracking it.
Making yourself agreeable was how you stayed warm.
It was how you navigated a system you couldn't control with the only tool available, yourself.
The tragedy is not that you learned it. The tragedy is that you're still deploying it in a room where you actually have power, where your job doesn't depend on managing your manager's feelings, where your belonging is not as provisional as it once was.
And the firmware doesn't know that. It just knows that someone in front of you has authority and that historically, making yourself small was how you survived. What the pattern is protecting underneath everything is the wound of inconsistent belonging.
The part of you that is still not entirely sure, in any room, that you are wanted for who you are rather than for what you produce.
And as long as that question stays alive, as long as the answer to am I safe here depends on how well you perform this week, the firmware will keep running. I'm not going to tell you to set better limits.
Limits are the surface.
We have been talking about something underneath the surface, and that is where the work has to happen. Here is the one thing. The attachment system runs on predictions.
Specifically, it runs on predictions about what happens when you stop performing, when you let the approval gap open, even slightly,
and see what comes back. Every time you preemptively apologize, agree, over-deliver, or shrink, you prevent yourself from collecting the data that could actually update the firmware. You close the loop before it can resolve. The anxious attachment strategy was built in an environment where the predictions were accurate,
where inconsistency was real, where approval was conditional.
And so the system never got the corrective experience it needed, the experience of dropping the performance and having the relationship survive. So the exercise is this, and it is small, deliberately small, because the firmware doesn't update in dramatic gestures.
This week, find one moment where the fawn response activates, where you are about to make yourself smaller than the situation requires, and don't. Not with confrontation,
not with a speech, just don't. Let the meeting end without the unnecessary apology.
Submit the work without the self-deprecating caveat. Sit with the discomfort of not having managed the other person's perception of you.
And then watch what happens. What you are doing in that moment is running a small experiment on the prediction. You are testing whether the approval really is as conditional as the firmware believes, and in most cases, not all, but most, you will find that the relationship survives.
That the approval doesn't evaporate. That you are more secure in this environment than the ancient protocol allows you to believe. That is what the attachment research calls a corrective relational experience.
It doesn't work once. It doesn't work dramatically.
But it works, slowly, cumulatively, the way any learning works, by replacing an old prediction with a new one data point at a time. You are not trying to become a different person. You are trying to give your nervous system evidence that the current environment is not the original one, that the rules have changed, even if the firmware hasn't caught up yet.
You will go back to work tomorrow, and your manager will schedule a meeting,
and something in you will run the old check.
The search will begin. The calculation will open.
That is going to happen.
Not because you're broken, not because the work we've done here didn't land, but because the firmware was written when you were very young, in circumstances that required it, and it is not going to rewrite itself overnight on the basis of one video.
What I hope is different is this. The next time you catch yourself making yourself small for a room that doesn't require it, the next time you hear the apology forming before the thought has finished, or feel the performance turning on, I hope you recognize what you're watching.
Not a character flaw, not a professional weakness.
The oldest, most loyal part of you, still doing the job it was given, still making you safe in a room it has confused with a room from 30 years ago.
The room you're actually in, the one with your real manager, your real job, your real colleagues. That room has different rules. You are allowed to find out what they are. So here is the question I want to leave you with, not to answer now, to carry until it surfaces on its own. In a moment when you're not performing for anyone, who would you be at work? How would you take up space? What would you ask for? What would you stop apologizing for if you were certain, all the way down, that your belonging here was not something you had to keep earning?
That question doesn't have a quick answer, but it is pointing at something real, something you have probably been circling for a long time,
without quite having the language to name it.
You have the language now.